The shuttle descended through layers of ochre clouds that hung over the proving grounds like a wound that wouldn't heal. I watched from the observation deck, my fingers pressed against the cold transparent steel, feeling the vibration of the engines through my boots. The sound was a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once, a sound I'd grown used to over 15 years of service with the Galactic Defense Corps. Below us, the landscape of Proxima 7 stretched out in all its hostile glory. From this height, it looked almost beautiful. The rust-colored terrain was scarred with deep ravines, and strange crystalline formations jutted up from the surface like frozen lightning strikes. The atmosphere had a faint purple tint to it, the result of the high concentration of reactive gases that made this planet a favorite testing ground for the Corps' most challenging evaluations. I'd been here before, 5 times to be exact. Each time I'd watched groups of cadets, the best of the best from across the galaxy, descend into that hellscape, and each time I'd watched them fail. Not all of them, of course. Some made it through with varying degrees of success. But success was a relative term on Proxima 7. The record for most completed objectives was held by a squad of Vrexian elites who managed to finish 63% of their assigned tasks before being extracted. 63%, that was the gold standard. Today, we had 45 cadets, 45 of the most promising young soldiers the galaxy had to offer. They'd been training for this moment for years, some of them for their entire lives. Their species came from worlds that made Earth look like a garden paradise, and their physical capabilities were, by any reasonable metric, extraordinary. And then there was the human. I'd noticed her the moment the shuttle doors opened. She was small, not by human standards, but by galactic standards. She was practically diminutive. The other cadets towered over her, their bulk and presence filling the shuttle bay with an almost tangible weight. There were Vrexians with their thick, armored carapaces and multiple limbs, Eskrel with their elongated frames and bioluminescent markings, and a pair of massive Cathari whose crystalline horns scraped against the ceiling. She stood among them like a child among adults. Her hair was cropped short, a practical cut that seemed almost aggressively utilitarian. Her uniform was standard issue, but it hung on her frame in a way that suggested she'd had to roll up the sleeves and tighten the waist just to make it fit. Her face was young, impossibly young, it seemed to me, with wide eyes that took in everything around her with a calm, almost disarming curiosity. I remembered the first time I'd seen a human. I was a junior officer then, fresh out of the academy and convinced I knew everything there was to know about the galaxy. Humans had just been admitted to the Corps, a controversial decision, to say the least. Most species considered them too fragile, too primitive, too, well, human. Their homeworld was classified as a Class 10 Deathworld, which was impressive enough. But their physical capabilities were laughable compared to the established military species. They couldn't regenerate limbs like the Vrexians. They couldn't manipulate electromagnetic fields like the Eskrel. They couldn't sense the thoughts of their enemies like the Cathari. All they had were their brains, their stubbornness, and a reputation for doing the unexpected. Still, I'd heard the whispers about this particular cadet. Her file had been flagged with numerous warnings and annotations. She had a tendency to improvise. Rules, regulations, standard operating procedures. These were suggestions to her, not commands. She'd been reprimanded multiple times during her training, and more than one instructor had recommended her removal from the program. But she was still here. And now, she was standing on Proxima 7, about to face the test that had broken the spirits of soldiers from 100 different worlds. The shuttle touched down with a heavy thud, and the landing ramp descended with a hydraulic hiss. The air that rushed in was thick and heavy, carrying the unmistakable scent of sulfur and something else, something metallic, like blood mixed with ozone. On the observation deck, I could hear the filtering systems working overtime to maintain breathable conditions for the observers. The cadets filed out, their movements crisp and practiced. They'd been briefed on every detail of this environment, the atmospheric composition, The native flora and fauna, the gravitational variations, the electromagnetic anomalies. They knew the risks. They'd been trained to handle them. As they assembled on the landing pad, I watched the human girl take her position. She was at the far end of the formation, tucked away like an afterthought. The Vrexian who stood beside her, a hulking figure named Czar 3K, seemed to be deliberately ignoring her presence. His 4 eyes were fixed forward, and his mandibles clicked with barely concealed contempt. I couldn't blame him, really. In his world, strength was measured in carapace thickness and the number of limbs you could bring to bear in combat. By those metrics, the human was a nonentity. But I'd learned something over the years. Never underestimate a human. I took my seat at the back of the observation gallery, a position I'd come to prefer over the years. From here, I could see everything. The cadets, the instructors, the massive holographic displays that dominated the center of the room. I could also see the exits, which was a habit I'd developed during my time in active service. Old soldiers never really stop being soldiers, even when they're supposed to be retired. The cadets filed in and took their positions in neat rows. The Vrexians stood at attention, their multiple legs planted firmly on the ground. The Eskrel slithered into place, their elongated bodies coiling into tight formations. The Cathari remained still, their crystalline forms refracting the light in rainbow patterns that were almost hypnotic. And the human girl found her spot at the edge of the group, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp. High Commander Vex appeared on the main holographic display, his image projected from somewhere in the central command hub. He was a Krogan, large, heavily muscled, with scars crisscrossing his face in a pattern that told the story of countless battles. His voice, when he spoke, was like gravel rolling down a mountainside. "Welcome to Proxima 7, he said, his tone brooking no argument. "You are here because you have been selected as the best candidates for the Galactic Defense Corps Elite Division. The 45 of you represent the pinnacle of military excellence across 17 species. You have trained for years. You have sacrificed. You have earned your place here." He paused, letting the words sink in. The cadets stood motionless, their attention fixed on the display. "Today you will face the Deathworld test. This is not a simulation. This is not a training exercise. This is the real thing, and the stakes are very real as well. Your objectives are straightforward. Survive for 72 hours while completing as many assigned tasks as possible. You will be monitored at all times. Your performance will determine your future in the Corps." A low murmur ran through the cadets. They'd known what to expect, of course, but hearing it from the High Commander himself carried a different weight. Vex continued. "The current record for this test is held by a squad of Vrexian elites, 63% of objectives completed. The average success rate across all species is 42%. Your goal should be to exceed these numbers." At this, I saw the human girl's lips twitch. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but I caught it. She was smiling. Not a nervous smile, not a defiant smile, but something else, something that looked almost like amusement. The briefing continued for another 30 minutes. Objectives were listed, equipment was assigned, and final instructions were given. The cadets would be dropped at various locations around the testing zone, each starting point determined by a randomized selection process. They would be on their own, but their progress would be monitored through the bio-trackers implanted in their uniforms. When the briefing ended, the cadets filed out to their respective deployment shuttles. I watched the human girl as she walked past me, close enough that I could see the small mole beside her left eye, the way her boots had been scuffed and worn by months of training. She caught my eye for a split second, and something in her gaze made me pause. It wasn't arrogance, it wasn't fear, it was certainty, the kind of certainty that only comes from having been through hell and come out the other side. I didn't know what she'd been through to get that look, but I was about to find out. The human girl's shuttle was one of the last to depart. I watched as it descended toward a section of the testing zone that was notoriously difficult, a region of deep canyons and treacherous terrain where even the most experienced soldiers had struggled. The instructors claimed it was random selection, but I knew better. Some species were given easier starting points, while others were deliberately placed in more challenging positions. It was the core way of balancing the scales, of ensuring that certain physical advantages didn't make the test too easy. The human had been placed in one of the hardest zones. No surprise there. I settled into my observation station, a small booth equipped with multiple screens showing different angles of the testing zone. Each cadet had been given a visual feed that could be monitored remotely, though I had to request access to specific channels. I chose the human's feed first, more out of curiosity than anything else. The shuttle landed on a narrow plateau surrounded by steep canyon walls. The terrain was rough and uneven, covered in sharp rocks and strange, spiny vegetation that seemed to writhe in the wind. The atmospheric readings were borderline toxic, high concentrations of sulfur dioxide, unpredictable pressure fluctuations, and a background radiation level that would have been fatal to most unshielded life forms. The human stepped out of the shuttle, her environment suit already adjusting to the conditions. She carried a standard-issue pack and a small handheld device that I recognized as a multi-spectrum analyzer. Her weapon, a compact pulse rifle, was slung across her back. She stood there for a moment, taking in her surroundings, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Then she knelt down, placed her hand on the ground and closed her eyes. I frowned. What was she doing? There was no reason to make physical contact with the surface. Her suit's sensors would provide all the data she needed about the terrain. She stayed in that position for nearly a minute. Finally, she opened her eyes, stood up, and began walking toward the nearest canyon wall. Not toward the path that the shuttle's navigation system had identified as the easiest route, but toward what appeared to be a sheer cliff face. "What are you doing?" I muttered under my breath. She reached the cliff and ran her fingers along the rock surface, feeling its texture. Then she did something that made me lean forward in my seat. She began to climb. Not just any climb, but a methodical, deliberate ascent that seemed to defy the laws of physics. She found handholds where I saw none, her fingers gripping microscopic fissures in the rock. Her boots found purchase on tiny ledges that I couldn't even see. She moved with a fluidity that spoke of years of practice, of a body that had been trained to navigate impossible surfaces. The other cadets, meanwhile, were having a much harder time. I switched through the feeds, watching the struggles of soldiers who were supposed to be the best of the best. A Vrexian squad had become bogged down in a swampy valley, their multiple limbs flailing in the thick mud. A group of Eskrel had been pinned down by the territorial creatures that inhabited the region, strange, quadrupedal beasts with razor-sharp claws. The Cathari were making good progress, their crystalline forms shimmering as they moved, but even they were slowed by the treacherous terrain. The human kept climbing. She reached the top of the cliff in under 15 minutes, scaling a face that the shuttle's sensors had identified as nearly vertical. At the summit, she paused to scan the horizon, her analyzer held up to her visor. Then she began walking again, moving with a purpose that suggested she knew exactly where she was going. I checked the objectives list. Her first assigned task was to reach the primary observation post, a facility located approximately 20 kilometers from her starting point. The post was at the center of the testing zone, and the route to it passed through the most hostile terrain on the planet. She was making good time, very good time. I watched her approach the facility, a small dome structure that was hidden among the rock formations, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. She'd traversed terrain that had defeated soldiers with superior physical capabilities, and she'd done it without breaking a sweat. The other cadets were far behind her. A Vrexian squad had made it to the halfway point, but they'd been forced to retreat twice due to hostile wildlife. The Eskrel were still dealing with the territorial creatures, and the Cathari had taken a detour that had added several hours to their journey. I switched back to the human's feed. She was at the observation post now, accessing the terminal inside. Her fingers moved across the keypad with practiced ease, entering codes and navigating menus. She was downloading data, the first objective completed. I checked the tracking system. 44 cadets were still in the field. The human had just done what no one else in the entire group had managed. She'd completed a task. A message appeared on the observation deck's main display. It was from the High Commander, and it was brief. "Who is Cadet Designation 47? I typed a response. Human female, name Sarah Chen, age 19, Earth. There was a pause, then. "Track her closely. I want updates every 15 minutes. I already was. The human, Sarah, had left the observation post and was moving toward her next objective. This one was more difficult, a series of signal relay towers that needed to be activated to establish a communication network across the testing zone. There were 5 towers, each located in a different quadrant of the zone, and they had to be activated in a specific sequence. The other cadets were still struggling with their first objectives, but Sarah was already moving ahead. She moved through the terrain with an ease that seemed almost supernatural, her compact frame navigating obstacles that would have tripped up soldiers twice her size. I zoomed in on her face, trying to read her expression. She looked calm, not bored exactly, but not particularly stressed either. This was just another day for her, just another walk in the park. I wondered what kind of life she'd led to make this seem easy. The cadets had been instructed to find shelter and conserve energy during the night cycle. The creatures that came out after dark were more aggressive, more dangerous, and even the best trained soldiers needed to be careful. I watched Sarah as she found a small cave in the canyon wall, tucking herself into a crevice that would provide protection from the wind. She didn't light a fire. That would have been visible from miles away, but she did something else. She started to dig. With her bare hands, she began to scrape away the soft soil at the back of the crevice, creating a small hollow that would give her more space. She worked methodically, her movements efficient and unhurried. Within 30 minutes, she'd created a space large enough to sit in comfortably, and she'd used rocks and debris to create a barrier at the entrance. Then she sat down, crossed her legs, and closed her eyes. She was meditating. In the middle of a Deathworld test, while her fellow cadets were being hunted by creatures that could tear through armor, she was meditating. I shook my head in disbelief. What kind of training had she received on Earth? What kind of world produced a soldier who could treat a test like this as a meditation retreat? I pulled up her file, reading through the details I'd skimmed before. Born in a city called San Francisco, in a region of Earth that was prone to natural disasters, earthquakes, fires, floods. She'd lost her parents at age 14, some kind of conflict that I didn't have the clearance to fully understand. She'd been taken in by a military program for war orphans, and she'd risen through the ranks at a rate that had caught the attention of her instructors. There were notes from her trainers. "Unconventional approach," one had written. "Rarely follows standard protocols but achieves results." Another, "Her ability to adapt is remarkable. She can be taught the rules, but she'll always find a way to bend them." A third, "There's something about her, something that makes me think she's been through worse than anything we can throw at her." I looked back at her feed. She was still meditating, her breathing slow and steady. The cave was dark, but the sensors in her suit picked up her vital signs. Heart rate normal, stress levels low, oxygen consumption minimal. She was more relaxed than I was, and I was sitting in a climate-controlled observation deck. She checked her equipment, ate a small portion of the rations she'd been given, and then she was gone. The second day was when the test typically got hard. The cadets would start to feel the cumulative effects of the environment, the toxic atmosphere, the difficult terrain, the constant threat of danger. Fatigue would set in. Mistakes would be made. Sarah seemed immune to all of it. She reached the first signal relay tower in just over an hour, climbing a steep ridge that had taken a squad of Vrexian elites 3 hours to traverse during a previous test. The tower was located at the summit, a metallic structure that rose 20 meters into the air. Sarah accessed the controls, activated the relay, and moved on. The second tower was in a swampy valley, the same valley that had stalled the Vrexian squad the day before. Sarah approached the valley, studied it for a moment, and then did something that made me sit up straighter in my chair. She took off her boots. She removed her equipment pack, setting it aside. Then she approached the swamp with bare feet, her toes sinking slightly into the mud. She moved slowly, deliberately, her weight distributed to avoid sinking too deeply. She made it across the swamp in half an hour, navigating terrain that had trapped soldiers with superior physical capabilities. I watched her reach the other side, sit down, and carefully clean the mud from her feet. She checked her feet for cuts or abrasions, applied a small amount of sealant from her pack, and put her boots back on. Then she activated the second tower. I was on my feet now, packing the observation deck. This wasn't possible. No one was this good. There had to be something in her file I'd missed, some advantage that explained her performance. I pulled up her medical records. They were unremarkable, standard human physiology, no genetic modifications, no enhancements. Her bone density was average for her species. Her muscle mass was typical for her age and gender. Her neural pathways showed no signs of augmentation. She was just a girl, a 19-year-old girl from a planet that the rest of the galaxy had dismissed as primitive and backward. And she was making the best soldiers in the galaxy look like amateurs. I switched to the other feeds, trying to figure out what was happening. The Vrexian squad had been extracted. They'd failed to make their first objective and were being pulled out for safety reasons. The Eskrel were still struggling with the territorial creatures, and the Cathari had gone off the grid. Their communication systems had been damaged in a rockslide, and they were trying to make it to the next extraction point. Sarah was moving toward the third tower when a creature emerged from the canyon walls. It was massive, easily 5 times her size, with chitinous armor and multiple limbs. Its eyes glowed with an eerie yellow light, and its mouth was filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. I recognized it from the planetary database, a canyon stalker, one of the most dangerous predators on Proxima 7. Sarah froze. For a moment I thought she was going to run, but then she did something unexpected. She knelt down. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered herself until she was kneeling on the ground. She placed her hands flat on the surface, palms down, and bowed her head. It was a gesture of submission, but it was more than that. It was something deeper, something primal. The creature paused, its multiple limbs twitching. It took a step closer, then another. Its head lowered, sniffing the air around Sarah. I held my breath. This was the moment. If the creature attacked, there was nothing I could do. The extraction team was over an hour away. Sarah stayed perfectly still, her head bowed, her hands on the ground. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. She just waited. The creature circled her, its limbs clicking against the rock. Then it did something that made me gasp. It lowered its head and touched its snout to Sarah's shoulder. It was sniffing her, assessing her, making a decision. Sarah remained motionless. After what felt like an eternity, the creature raised its head, let out a low rumbling sound, and walked away. It disappeared into the canyon, leaving Sarah alone. She stayed in the kneeling position for another minute, then slowly rose to her feet. Her heart rate was elevated, her breathing was faster, but her face showed no fear. She simply looked after the creature, nodded once, and continued on her way. I slumped back in my chair, my heart pounding. I just witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible. The canyon stalker wasn't known for showing mercy. It was known for eating whatever it encountered, no questions asked. But it had let her go. It had practically bowed to her. I pulled up the bio-tracker data trying to understand what had happened. The creature's behavior had been anomalous. It had shown signs of recognition. No, that wasn't right. It had shown signs of respect. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. This was impossible. A human girl had just faced one of the deadliest creatures on Proxima 7 and had come out not just alive, but unharmed. And she was still moving toward her objective. Sarah approached the edge of the razor fields and studied the terrain. The crystalline formations rose from the ground like jagged knives, some of them reaching heights of 3 or 4 meters. They caught the light in dazzling patterns, refracting it into rainbows that were almost beautiful. She started to walk through the fields. I watched, my eyes wide, as she navigated the treacherous terrain with an ease that bordered on supernatural. She weaved through the formations, her movements precise, her footing sure. She didn't look down. She didn't need to. She seemed to have an instinctive sense of where each step should land. The other cadets had been avoiding this area entirely. A Vrexian squad had tried to cross the razor fields during a previous test, and they'd lost 3 soldiers to the crystalline formations. The Cathari had given it a wide berth, and the Eskrel had been forced to turn back after their elongated bodies proved too difficult to maneuver through the narrow passages. Sarah made it across in under 2 hours. She reached the 3rd tower, activated its controls, and checked the data on her analyzer. Then she sat down for a moment, drinking from her water supply and eating a small portion of her rations. She looked tired now, I noticed. The exertion was finally starting to show. Her movements were slightly slower, her breathing slightly heavier, but she wasn't stopping. She was going to keep going. I checked the tracking system. The other cadets were still struggling with their objectives. The Vrexian squad had been extracted, the Eskrel were making slow progress, and the Cathari had finally re-established communication and were heading toward their next target. Sarah had already completed 3 tasks. No one else had completed more than 1. Sarah reached the edge of the canyon and looked down. The tower was visible at the bottom, a tiny speck in the darkness. The wind was howling, sending dust and debris into the air. She didn't hesitate, she started down. I watched her descend, her movements careful but confident. She found handholds and footholds that seemed to appear from nowhere, her small frame allowing her to navigate spaces that would have been impossible for larger soldiers. The wind was fierce, nearly pushing her off the path several times, but she held on. Halfway down, she stopped. A section of the path had collapsed, leaving a gap that was too wide to jump. She studied the gap, looking for a way around it. Then she did something that shocked me. She climbed onto the canyon wall itself, using the uneven surface as a ladder. Her fingers found tiny cracks in the rock, her boots finding purchase on the smallest ledges. She moved sideways across the wall, her body pressed flat against the surface, until she reached the other side of the collapsed path. She continued down. 45 minutes later, she reached the bottom of the canyon. She was breathing hard, her face streaked with sweat, but her eyes were still sharp. She activated the 4th tower, checked the data, and immediately began climbing back up. The wind was even stronger now, and the path was even more treacherous. But she didn't slow down. She climbed methodically, never looking back, never hesitating. She reached the top in just over an hour. I checked the tracking system. The other cadets were still far behind. The Eskrel had completed their 2nd objective, and the Cathari had completed their 1st. Sarah had just completed her 4th. The human girl was now ahead of everyone else, by a factor of 3. Sarah approached the base of the incline and looked up. The tower was visible at the top, a tiny speck against the orange sky. The climb was nearly vertical, with few handholds and no easy paths. She started to climb. This was different from her previous climbs. This was harder, more demanding. The incline was steep, and the rock was crumbly, making it difficult to find secure handholds. The wind was fierce, threatening to tear her from the surface. She climbed for hours, her pace slow but steady. She took breaks when she needed to, finding small ledges to rest on, but she never stopped for long. She was determined to reach the top. I watched her progress, my heart in my throat. This was the hardest part of the test, and she was doing it alone. No support, no backup, no one to help her if she fell. She kept climbing. Near the top, she encountered the worst obstacle yet. A section of the rock that was completely vertical, with no handholds at all. She studied it for a long moment, looking for a solution. Then she reached into her pack and pulled out a small device I didn't recognize. It looked like a compact grappling hook, but the design was different from anything I'd seen before. She pressed a button, and a small projectile shot upward, embedding itself in the rock above. She tested the line, then began to climb. I leaned forward, my eyes fixed on the feed. This was the moment. If the line held, she'd reach the top. If it didn't. The line held. She reached the summit, her face streaked with tears that I realized were actually sweat. She lay there for a moment, catching her breath, then she sat up and looked around. The view was spectacular. The entire testing zone spread out below her, the orange terrain broken by deep canyons and sparkling crystalline formations. The sky was a mix of purple and gold, and the wind carried the scent of ozone and something else, something like victory. She activated the fifth tower, and a message appeared on my console. All signal relay towers activated. Objective complete. I stared at the message, unable to believe what I was seeing. No one had ever completed this objective. Not once, in all the years the Deathworld test had been conducted. Sarah sat at the top of the tower, looking out over the landscape. Her face was tired, but her eyes were alive with a quiet satisfaction. She'd done it. She'd completed the hardest objective in the entire test. And she'd made it look easy. The other cadets were still in the field, struggling to complete their objectives. The Eskrel had managed to complete 2 more tasks, and the Cathari had done the same, but no one had come anywhere close to Sarah's performance. She was greeted by a team of medical personnel who checked her vitals, treated a few minor cuts and abrasions, and pronounced her fit. She was also greeted by the High Commander, who appeared in person, a rare honor for any cadet. "Sarah Chen," he said, his gravelly voice echoing in the observation deck. "I've been watching you. I've seen what you've done." She nodded, her expression neutral. "Thank you, sir." The High Commander studied her for a long moment. "You completed 5 objectives in less than 30 hours. No one has ever done that. No one has even come close." She shrugged slightly. The conditions were favorable. He laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to surprise even him. "Favorable? Girl, you traversed the razor fields, climbed down into a canyon with a collapsed path, and scaled a 1,000-meter incline. There was nothing favorable about those conditions." She didn't respond. She just stood there, her hands clasped behind her back, her eyes fixed on the commander. The High Commander shook his head, his expression shifting from amusement to something else, something like wonder. "I've been doing this for 40 years, Cadet Chen. I've watched thousands of soldiers take this test. I've seen the strongest, the fastest, the most dangerous soldiers in the galaxy fail. And then you come along, a human, and you make it look like a walk in the park." He paused, his gaze steady. "Where did you learn to do this?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "On Earth, sir. I grew up in a city that was destroyed by the very people you're training us to fight. I lost everything, my parents, my home, my future. And I learned that the only way to survive is to keep moving." She met his gaze. "That's what I did here, sir. I kept moving. I found the gaps, the weaknesses, the places where the rules don't apply. That's what we do on Earth. We adapt. We survive. We find a way." The High Commander was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Welcome to the Galactic Defense Corps, Cadet Chen," he said. "You've earned your place." But she stood out. Even among the elites, she was something special. The High Commander gave a speech about dedication, about sacrifice, about the importance of pushing beyond your limits. But my eyes were fixed on Sarah. She stood at attention, her posture perfect, her face calm. The other cadets watched her with a mixture of envy and respect. The Vrexians, the Eskrel, the Cathari, they all knew what she'd done. They all knew she'd achieved something they couldn't. When the ceremony was over, I approached her. She was alone, standing at the edge of the observation deck, looking out at the landscape that had been her proving ground. "Sarah," I said, "I'm Commander Hayes. I've been watching you." She turned to face me, her eyes assessing. "Sir." "You were remarkable out there," I said, "truly remarkable." She smiled slightly. "Thank you, sir, but it wasn't just me. I had good training." I shook my head. "Training can only take you so far. What you did out there, that came from somewhere else. That came from experience." She was quiet for a moment, her gaze dropping to the floor. Then she spoke, her voice soft. "You're right, sir. It came from losing everything. It came from knowing that if I don't keep moving, I'll end up like everyone else I've lost." I nodded slowly. "I understand." She looked up at me, and I saw something in her eyes that made my heart ache. It was the look of someone who'd been through hell and come out the other side. It was the look of someone who'd learned that survival was just another word for hope. "When I was a kid," she said, "I used to wonder why my parents kept fighting. I didn't understand what they were so determined to protect, but now I get it. They were protecting the future. They were making sure that I'd have a chance to live." She paused, her eyes distant. "That's what I was doing out there, sir. I was protecting the future. I was making sure that I'd get to live." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and watched her walk away. She rose through the ranks with a speed that was almost unprecedented. Her unconventional methods, which had once been seen as a liability, were now viewed as an asset. She led missions that others thought impossible, saved lives that others thought lost. She became a legend. And then, 18 years after her Deathworld test, I heard that she was coming to visit my posting, a small outpost on the edge of known space. I didn't know why she was coming, but I looked forward to seeing her. She arrived on a shuttle, stepping onto the landing pad with the same calm, confident gait I remembered. She was older now, her face showing the lines of experience, but her eyes were still the same, sharp, assessing, alive with a quiet determination. "Commander Hayes," she said, saluting me, "good to see you again." "Sarah," I said, returning the salute, "I've been following your career. You've done well." She smiled. "Thank you, sir, but I had good help." I led her into the outpost, showing her around the facility. We talked about old times, about the Deathworld test, about everything that had happened since. "Why are you here, Sarah?" I asked eventually. "What brings you to this outpost?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice low. "I've been thinking about the test, sir, about everything that happened, and I realized something." She paused, her gaze distant. "I realized that I've been running my whole life, running from the past, running from the pain, running from everything I've lost. But you can't run forever. Eventually, you have to stop. Eventually, you have to face what's been chasing you." I nodded slowly. "And what's been chasing you?" She looked at me, her eyes full of a sadness I hadn't seen in 18 years. "The ghosts, sir. The ghosts of everyone I've lost. My parents, my friends, my brothers and sisters in arms. They're all still with me, and I've been running from them for too long." She took a deep breath. "I'm here to stop running. I'm here to face my ghosts, and I'm here to ask you to help me." "I was 10 years old when it happened," she said. "My parents had been fighting in the resistance for years. They were good people, sir. They just wanted to protect their home." I nodded, not interrupting. "The day it happened, I was at school. I remember hearing the sirens and then the ground shaking and then nothing. I woke up in a shelter covered in dust. The school was gone. My parents were gone. My friends were gone. She paused, her voice trembling slightly. I was alone. I was 10 years old and I was alone. I felt tears in my own eyes. I didn't try to hide them. I spent the next few years surviving, she continued. Learning to fight, learning to adapt, learning to keep moving. I joined the military as soon as I was old enough. I wanted to fight, sir. I wanted to make sure that what happened to me didn't happen to anyone else. But you never dealt with it, I said softly. You never dealt with the grief. She shook her head. No, sir, I never did. I just kept moving. I thought if I moved fast enough, the past couldn't catch up with me. She smiled then, a sad smile that made my heart ache. But it does catch up, doesn't it? Eventually. I've spent 18 years running from my ghosts and they're still there. They're still waiting for me. I didn't know what to say, but she didn't seem to need words. The test, sir, she said. I completed it in 30 hours because I'd already faced worse. I'd already faced the worst thing in the universe, and I survived. She paused, her eyes distant. But I realized something else too. I realized that survival isn't enough. You have to live. You have to find meaning. You have to face your ghosts and make peace with them. She looked at me, her eyes full of a determination I recognized. That's what I'm going to do now, sir. I'm going to stop running. I'm going to go home and I'm going to face what I've been running from. And I'm going to find a way to live. Thank you, Commander, Sarah said, for everything. I shook my head. I didn't do anything. You did all the work. She smiled. You watched over me, sir. When I was out there alone, you were watching. That meant more than you know. I nodded, my throat tight. Be careful out there, Sarah, and when you get home, give those ghosts my best. She laughed, a genuine, heartfelt laugh that seemed to light up the darkness. I will, sir, and Commander. Yes. Thank you for believing in me. When everyone else saw a girl from a primitive world, you saw something more. I shook my head again, but this time I was the one who was sad. I didn't see anything. I just watched. You did the rest. She nodded, then turned and walked toward the shuttle. Just before she boarded, she stopped and looked back. Commander Hayes, she said, I never forgot what you said about staying alive, about finding hope. You gave me a reason to keep going, even when it felt impossible. I smiled. That's what we do, Sarah. We take care of each other. She nodded, then stepped onto the shuttle. The doors closed behind her, and the engines hummed to life. I watched the shuttle ascend into the darkness, carrying Sarah Chen, the girl who'd made the Deathworld test look easy, back to her homeworld. But then, 2 years later, I received a message. It was brief, just a few lines, but it made my heart soar. Commander Hayes. I did it. I went home, I faced my ghosts, and I made peace with them. It wasn't easy, nothing ever is, but I did it. And now I'm ready to live. I'm ready to help others live too. I've started a foundation for war orphans. I'm going to give them the same chance I had, the chance to build a future, to find purpose, to keep moving forward. Thank you for everything. You taught me that survival isn't about running. It's about finding a reason to stay. With gratitude. Sarah Chen. I read the message several times, tears streaming down my face. Sarah Chen, the girl who'd made the Deathworld test look easy, had found her reason to stay. And in doing so, she'd become something more than just a soldier. She'd become a symbol of hope. I followed her journey, watching from a distance as she built a new future for herself and for others. She was no longer running from her ghosts. She was facing them, embracing them, and using them to make the galaxy a better place. And then, one day, I received a second message, this one in the form of a package. Inside was a small medal, the kind awarded to soldiers who'd achieved something extraordinary. Attached to it was a note. Commander Hayes, I want you to have this. It's the medal I received for completing the Deathworld test. I don't need it anymore. I've found something more important to hold on to. You were the first person who ever believed in me. You watched over me when I was alone, and you gave me the strength to keep going. I'll never forget that. Thank you for being my guardian angel. With all my gratitude. Sarah Chen. I held the medal in my hands, feeling its weight. It was just a piece of metal, but it meant so much more. Sarah Chen had been through the worst the universe could throw at her. She'd faced her fears, survived her trials, and emerged stronger. And in the process, she'd proven that even the smallest, most fragile beings could accomplish great things. And then, at the end, I added something I'd been wanting to say for a long time. You asked me once what I believed in, Sarah. I told you that I believed in staying alive, in finding hope. I still believe that, but I also believe in something else. I believe in people like you. People who face impossible odds and make it look easy. People who teach us that there's always a reason to keep going. Thank you for being one of those people. I never saw Sarah again after that. Our correspondence continued, but we never met in person. She was always traveling, always working, always helping others. But I kept the medal she'd sent me, and I kept her story close to my heart. Sarah Chen had proven that even the most fragile among us could be strong. She'd faced the impossible and won. She'd found a reason to live when she'd lost everything. And she'd made the Deathworld test look easy.